A child in a group of 30 refused to do what an adult told them to do. We don't know what was asked. We don't know how old the child was. We know it happened because it always happens. And here is what the adult almost certainly did not do. They did not punish the child. You have a timeout. You have consequences. You have the entire architecture of modern discipline: rewards, punishments, systems, rules. They had one group, one fire, one set of survival tasks that everyone needed to contribute to eventually, and a child who was, by almost every account across cultures, considered an autonomous individual whose desires were not to be thwarted. So, what does a group do when a child won't cooperate, with no schools, no pediatricians, and no parenting books, and somehow produces adults who actually want to participate? The most documented feature of hunter-gatherer child rearing is something anthropologists call indulgent parenting. Not indulgence in the modern pejorative sense, not spoiling, not permissiveness without structure. Indulgence as a technical term meaning highly responsive to children's expressed needs and desires, non-coercive in managing behavior, and oriented toward the child's emerging autonomy rather than toward compliance with adult directives. David Lancy of Utah State University, who has spent more than 40 years studying child rearing across traditional cultures, puts it directly: children in hunter-gatherer societies are considered autonomous individuals whose desires are not thwarted. They are permitted to explore dangerous objects, make their own decisions, and learn from the natural consequences of those decisions without adult intervention managing the outcome. The Inuit child allowed to explore a hazardous object because parents presume the child knows what it is doing. The Jew/Honsi children who very rarely cried, not because their distress was ignored, but because there was so little to cry about. The Australian Aboriginal children described as indulged to an extreme degree, with physical punishment almost unheard of. This pattern appears across cultures that had no contact with each other, which means it's telling you something about the conditions ancient human child rearing operated in, say, not about cultural accident. So, what were those conditions? And what did they produce? Here's the number that explains the whole system. In a hunter-gatherer group, the adult-to-child ratio during the day is nothing like the adult-to-child ratio in a modern household or classroom. A child moving through a camp of 30 adults is surrounded by multiple caregivers at all times, not just parents, but aunts, uncles, older siblings, grandparents, unrelated adults who share responsibility for the group's children. Anthropologists call this alloparenting, care of children by individuals other than the biological parents. Sarah Hrdy, in her landmark work on cooperative breeding in humans, argues that alloparenting is not a cultural add-on to human child rearing. It is the evolved baseline. Humans appear to be cooperative breeders, a species in which the biological parents are not the sole or even primary caregivers, but one node in a distributed care network. In that network, no individual adult needs to force compliance. The child is embedded in social learning that runs through every interaction with every adult in the group. So why doesn't this network produce children who do whatever they want? If your parenting brain just lit up, subscribe. UG raised children in a group of 30 adults and has thoughts, ancient thoughts, possibly useful ones. The answer requires understanding what compliance is actually for and what hunter-gatherer children were learning instead of it. In modern industrial societies, child obedience serves a specific function. It allows a small number of adults, usually 2 parents or 1 teacher managing 30 children, to manage large numbers of children efficiently in structured environments. The math of modern child management makes compliance necessary. You cannot run a classroom or a household schedule without children who respond to adult directives. Hunter-gatherer child management had different math. With many adults available and no fixed schedule that children had to fit into, the pressure to produce immediate, consistent compliance was lower. What mattered was producing children who could eventually function independently in an unpredictable environment, children who could observe, reason, make decisions, and learn from consequences. The research on hunter-gatherer learning documents this specifically. Children in these contexts learn predominantly through observation and autonomous practice, what researchers call learning by doing. They watch adults perform tasks, they attempt the tasks themselves, they fail, they adjust. Adults do not typically intervene to correct or instruct unless the child explicitly asks for help. The Nava documentation of Israeli forest hunter-gatherers found that adults were fully aware of children's activities, but consciously chose not to interfere, operating on the principle that children need to learn by themselves. This is not neglect. It is a deliberate pedagogical stance, one that produces children with high autonomy, high self-regulation, and sophisticated problem-solving skills precisely because they were never rescued from the consequences of their own decisions. The ancient approach to a child refusing to do something was, in many documented cases, approximately fine. The child will eventually figure out why the thing needed doing. The child will be approximately 30 years old at that point, but they will have arrived at the conclusion themselves, which means it will actually stick. Here's the mechanism that makes this work at the developmental level, because it's not just a cultural preference, there's neuroscience underneath it. Self-determination theory, developed by Edward D.C. and Richard Ryan, proposes that human motivation runs on three core needs: autonomy, the sense that your actions are self-chosen; competence, the sense that you are capable; and relatedness, the sense that you are connected to others. When these needs are met, intrinsic motivation, the drive to engage with activities for their own sake, is high. When they're frustrated, motivation becomes externally dependent. The child does things only when compelled and stops when the compulsion is removed. Coercive compliance management directly undermines autonomy and competence. A child told to do something under threat of punishment learns to respond to external pressure and learns simultaneously that their own motivation and judgment are not the relevant variable. The long-term outcome is exactly what modern parenting research consistently documents. Children who are externally managed become adolescents, and adults who require external management because the internal motivation system never developed the way it would have under conditions of greater autonomy. Hunter-gatherer parenting, across cultures and without any knowledge of self-determination theory, was running exactly the conditions that produce intrinsic motivation. Not through indifference to outcomes, but through a specific belief about how children become capable adults. Here's the cross-cultural finding that puts a number on the difference. A 2023 Journal of Comparative Research in Anthropology and Sociology study analyzing hunter-gatherer versus agrarian child-rearing practices found that hunter-gatherer societies scored significantly higher on all 5 measured parental attitude dimensions, including warmth, responsiveness, and indulgence, while agrarian societies showed the presence of physical punishment and practices focused on submission. The most pronounced disparity between the two types of cultures was in indulgent parenting. Hunter-gatherer parents were dramatically more indulgent. Agrarian parents were dramatically more coercive. The timing of this shift, from indulgent forager parenting to coercive agrarian parenting, corresponds exactly to the transition to agriculture. When children's labor became economically valuable, when schedules had to be kept, when fields had to be worked, the pressure to produce compliant children increased, and the methods changed accordingly. Coercive parenting is not ancient, it is agricultural. This is the reframe that changes the whole picture. The assumption that children need to be forced into cooperative behavior is not a discovery about child nature. It is a cultural adaptation to the specific demands of agricultural and industrial economies. Hunter-gatherer children were not forced to cooperate. They wanted to. Not because they were better children, but because the conditions of their development produced children who found participation in group activities intrinsically rewarding. The alloparenting network meant they were surrounded by caring adults from the beginning. The autonomous learning approach meant they developed genuine competence and the confidence that comes with it. The group structure meant that cooperative participation was visibly meaningful. When the group ate what the hunt produced, the connection between contribution and outcome was immediate and concrete. Modern children develop in conditions that often frustrate all 3 of these features simultaneously. Nuclear family isolation reduces the alloparenting network to one or two exhausted adults. Structured educational environments reduce autonomous learning to managed instruction. And the connection between a child's effort and meaningful group outcomes is often abstract or invisible. It's hard to see why doing your homework matters to anyone. The result, predictably, is children who don't particularly want to cooperate, not because children have changed, but because the conditions that produce cooperative motivation have been systematically removed. This is not an argument that modern parents are doing something wrong. It is an observation that the conditions most modern parents are working within, isolated two-parent households, structured schedules, institutional child management, are conditions that make the ancient approach difficult or impossible to reproduce, and that create the compliance problems they do precisely because they've removed the conditions that made compliance unnecessary. What hunter-gatherer children were taught was not how to obey. They were taught how to observe, how to try, how to fail, and how to adjust. They were taught through the accumulated example of every adult in the group, not through the directives of one overwhelmed caregiver trying to get a 5-year-old into shoes before a deadline. There's a practical window that this opens. The alloparenting network is gone for most modern families. You can't recreate it by yourself. But the pedagogical stance it enabled, autonomous learning, allowing natural consequences, resisting the urge to intervene before the child has had a chance to figure it out, is reproducible in individual interactions. The research on this is consistent. Children given more autonomy in goal setting and learning approach develop stronger intrinsic motivation, higher self-regulation, and better long-term outcomes by almost every metric. This is not a small effect in the developmental psychology literature. It is one of the most robust findings in the field. The ancient approach wasn't hands-off parenting in the sense of not caring. It was hands-off in the sense of trusting the child's developmental process, trusting that a child who is genuinely embedded in a caring group, given real autonomy, and allowed to experience real consequences, will develop the motivation and competence to participate without being forced. That trust is hard to maintain in a world where the group is small and the schedule is real, and the consequences of not participating often fall immediately on one exhausted parent. The ancient conditions made trust easier. Modern conditions make coercion feel necessary. Neither generation of children is fundamentally different. The conditions are. Step back, and the disobedient child looks less like a parenting failure and more like a mismatch signal. A child who won't comply with adult directives in a modern context may be running exactly the autonomy drive that ancient conditions were designed to cultivate, in an environment that has removed the features that would have channeled that drive into genuine competence and cooperative participation. The drive isn't the problem. The conditions are the problem. And the conditions, isolated households, small adult-to-child ratios, structured schedules that require compliance, disconnection between children's effort and meaningful group outcomes, are the conditions that agriculture and industrialization created, not the conditions that human children were built for. The ancient answer to the disobedient child wasn't better discipline. It was better conditions, more adults, more autonomous learning, more visible connection between participation and group outcomes. Trusting the developmental process over a longer time horizon than the immediate deadline requires, modern parents can't recreate all of that, but knowing what the conditions were designed to produce changes what you're trying to do. You're not trying to force compliance. You're trying to cultivate the motivation that makes compliance unnecessary. Here's the one thing. The next time you're in a standoff with a child who won't do something, before you escalate to force or threat, try the autonomous option first. Not explaining why the thing needs doing. Not negotiating, asking, do you want to figure out how to do this yourself, or do you want my help? The ancient approach wasn't hands-off because adults didn't care about outcomes. It was hands-off because giving the child the first attempt with real stakes, real consequences, and genuine adult interest in what happens produces learning and motivation that coercion doesn't. The child who figured it out, even imperfectly, owns the outcome in a way that the child who was forced to comply never does. This doesn't work for every situation, every age, or every deadline. But it works more often than most parents expect because what looks like refusal is often the child's autonomous drive trying to find the version of the task that feels self-chosen. Give it the space to find that version. Even briefly, the ancient record suggests it's worth the wait. And if the idea that coercive parenting is agricultural rather than ancient, that the assumption children need to be forced into cooperation is a cultural product of farming, not a discovery about child nature, makes you want to rethink what else you assumed was ancient that might be very new? Good. That's exactly the right instinct. What else we assumed was human nature, but is actually a recent invention. That's where this whole series keeps going. Next one is already up.